In this section, we're going to talk about resumes. You may be asking yourself, I don't need a resume, I just apply online. Well, when you apply online, you're essentially building the same resume over and over again. So even if you're applying to somewhere that doesn't directly use a resume, you can at least use the content here to copy and paste it into the job application online. We'll start with what I consider a very important difference: a resume versus a curriculum vitae or a CV. A resume is 2 pages. It's what we use in the United States, and it's focused on skill. A curriculum vitae is lots of pages, 10 pages, 20 pages, and it's what's used outside of the US or in academia, meaning if you're applying for an academic position, you're going to be using a CV instead of a resume. It is going to be focused on academic accomplishments instead of a set of skills. I bring this up because if a job posting asks for a resume and you give a CV, people will sometimes look at that and think you failed the first most important instruction and throw it out. Don't be that person. There's a lot of variety in the recommended formats for a resume, but in 2 pages there's only so much stuff you can stick there. So I recommend a fairly straightforward name, skills, job type layout that I've specified here, noting that there's a ton of variation with it. At the end of the day, if someone decides to give you feedback on a resume, I would consider it because resume feedback is very, very rare. Also consider that a general resume service really isn't going to know what needs to go on a resume in terms of being a software developer. This is something which is very skill focused and is going to directly reflect your particular skill set and the types of jobs you're applying for. It's important to consider that you need to fill space in the resume. Just because you don't have enough skills or accomplishments or job history, you can rearrange things in the resume. You can have additional accomplishments. If you don't have enough skills, you can put education. If you don't have education, you can put certifications. If you don't have a lot of job experience, for example, you can extend patents, other awards, and even personal projects onto the second page. The idea is to fill the space and to give the person looking at your resume a good idea of what you're about. In terms of general advice, the first one should be fairly obvious: don't lie. That may seem like I shouldn't need to say this, but consider that a lot of times that resume is going to be the way in which you are interviewed. I tend to base my technical screens off of a person's resume content. Because the world of tech is so broad, you can't just assume one set of questions is going to work for everybody. Especially when it gets to some of these specializations, you're going to have different expertise. For example, I may be hiring someone to do builds and pipelines, and I don't care if it's Ant or Maven or Gradle, but if they don't know Gradle, I'm not going to ask them a Gradle question. But if they state they're an expert in Maven, for example, I'm going to ask them a Maven question. If they can't answer that basic Maven question, that's a big red flag. We'll get into what some of those red flags are later, but you're going to end up hanging yourself by overinflating or lying on your resume. Relating to that, if you're listing something on your resume, be prepared to answer a question about it. And understand that just having used something once 10 years ago doesn't mean you're really going to be able to answer a question about it. That's why it's important to keep your resume current. Also, don't hide keywords in the margin. I've seen this more of a common trend to try to get around those resume scanners. Especially listing keywords that have nothing to do with your actual skill set in the margin is what I call an instant failure. If you try to cheat and lie on your resume, I can assume you're going to try to do the same when you're actually in the job. So you're not going to get hired. You won't even pass the resume screen. As pointed out earlier, if it asks for a resume, don't give them something more than 2 pages. That's a curriculum vitae. Also, don't copy someone else's resume. This is very common, especially amongst some less reputable contracting firms, to take one resume and just kind of change the names on it. We got this one resume through, so we'll just change the names on it and hope we get these other people's through. You're not only wasting the time with the person doing the tech screen, it's also incredibly dishonest and will cause sometimes us to, what we call, blocklist a particular contracting firm for unethical behavior. Linked along with this section, I've given the example resume format I use. And I'll go through each one of these sections, but what I wanted to demonstrate is the idea is that it's skill focused. You can see a bulk of this resume is dedicated, the entire first page, to different skills, with education being kind of in the lower left-hand corner. An important aspect I've recently liked to do, though, is instead of just listing page after page of job history, to really focus that first page on calling out specific things and accomplishments you did, relating to whatever the job application is. Reserve the second page for your specific experience, or if you don't have enough experience, maybe put personal projects and maybe some of the other aspects like awards or related certifications on the second page. Maintaining a social media presence has become vital for being able to network. This is just how we communicate and is also the mechanism by which we get a lot of jobs and opportunities. I'll specifically call out LinkedIn as being a good place for resources. It's also something that you'll typically be asked to give when submitting a job application. It's important to have LinkedIn represent a somewhat higher level in some aspects and lower level in others representation of your resume. It's specifically going to ask for you to call out and feature things, give some information about yourself, and otherwise list the different places that you've worked. I found that LinkedIn has been the source for a lot of good opportunities. And if you don't have a LinkedIn or it's not up to date or reflective of your current experiences, you're not going to get opportunities from that. As mentioned in the section about getting experience, your personal projects are an important aspect of who you are as a software developer. It's a way for people to look at what you're interested in, but also how you think and how you work. That's why you're going to find that a lot of people take the time to make public their own personal projects and research ideas. This is very important, especially if you're starting out and don't have a lot of experience. Being able to look at how you code, how you test, and how you think about solving problems can be really important when there's a lack of experience to draw from, because there's only so much we can cover in a 30-minute or hour-long interview. When it comes to calling out your skills, instead of just giving 3 paragraphs of keywords, I like to categorize them. But consider that the categories are going to be very specific to your own career journey. In my case, I've called out things like cloud and Java, build, web, and infrastructure. That's very reflective of what I've done, which is a whole lot of architecture and DevOps style work. So I have a series of skill categorizations that reflect that I've done a lot of work in cloud, that I specialize in Java, and that I've also done a lot of work in terms of build and infrastructure. It's recommended to put here what you know best. Remember that you're going to be asked questions about this. So for example, when I say I know Java and I put a whole list of stuff having to do with Java there, I expect someone to ask me about Spring integration, and not just if I know it, I expect them to ask me a detailed question about Spring integration. And so if you're not prepared to answer a question beyond what does this actually mean, don't list it in this part of your resume. It's also important to use what we call the correct capitalization here. For example, when I said MySQL, it was a capital M, lowercase y, and then a capital SQL. That's how it's spelled in terms of industry standards. Whenever someone lists something in their resume and doesn't use the correct capitalization, that tends to have the person think maybe they really don't know this, because if they really knew it, they would have capitalized it like it's commonly found. Also consider that this skill section is going to greatly change over time. If I were to look at what I specialized in 15 years ago, some of these technologies wouldn't even exist on it, and there would also be a different emphasis. In my case, I got my start as just a pure Java developer, in a lot of cases focusing only on front-end and desktop applications. And so that resume would have called out a ton of different Java technologies, from abstract windowing toolkit to Swing. The education section is really meant for just more than education. This is where you want to put special courses or certifications that are tied to whatever the role is. The formal education itself has become less important. Specifically for higher level positions, education isn't something we really even care about. If you've been doing this for 15 years, you have the appropriate experience to supplement any of the education you might have missed. Also consider that for those of us that are longer in our careers than others, the education that we had way back when is very different than what it is now. I was taught, for example, tools and technologies that no longer even exist. I had to learn new ones. So over time, that education becomes less relevant. I also recommend giving an opening statement, but this can also be a matter of opinion. Others like to take the same information and put it in a cover letter. It's a matter of preference, and you can kind of do whatever you want here. I think it's important to really just give an opening paragraph about what you're about, Tell them what you think. It's what we call an elevator pitch. If you're not familiar with that, the idea is that you've cornered somebody important in an elevator and you have exactly 2 minutes to try to get them to hire you or do what you want. That's what you're doing here. It's an opening statement, really trying to catch someone's attention to say, hey, hire me, I'm different than everyone else, here's how I think. Consider, though, this may be the only thing that some people read. They may look at this and think, well, this person really likes CI, CD, Agile, DevOps, and Cloud. We don't really care about that. I don't need to read any further. Well, if that's what you care about and they don't, you probably dodged the bullet there. Something that I've come to recently do in my resume is, instead of just listing out that job history, to really focus on keywords as they relate to positions and otherwise have them be action focused. Instead of just telling somebody I worked at company A and I did stuff involving security, I want to just call out and say, hey, I did cybersecurity work on multiple places, and then list out some bullet points outlining specifically what you did, and in some cases it's recommended you call out individual technologies to help supplement what you didn't have the ability to list inside your skills section. This being action focused, you also want to stick it on current work. You don't want to try and rely on things that happened 10 years ago. You probably are not going to be able to remember them at any level of detail. But the idea here is you want to call out the things that you find really important. That also is what you're looking for in the job for which you're applying. In terms of the job history, depending on how much space you're trying to save, I recommend always listing the company along with the title you had while you were there. But consider that because the job titles can sometimes be odd, it's recommended that next to it you list what the actual title is from an industry standard perspective. For example, in this case, I was a senior consulting systems developer. That really doesn't have any meaning outside of that one company, so I went ahead and said, oh, this was a lead architect position. And then, of course, give the dates of your employment. Don't worry about the day, no one can remember those, just give the month. The idea is you want to show how long you were employed there. Then under that, you want to call out 3, maybe more depending on how much space you're having, with specific achievements you did while you were there. You're wanting to draw attention that you accomplished something and that this is what you could also bring to a new job effort. When writing the resume, beyond some of the red flags we've already mentioned, we want to additionally call out some others. I'll go back to the length, which I've now brought up for a third time. Please don't make it longer than 2 pages. Some people are actually required to read every single line in a resume, and when you provide a 12-page resume, you're making them read 10 additional pages and taking up a lot of their time. You also want to avoid typos. This can be really hard because a lot of the abbreviations we use in software aren't recognized by the average word processor. It's good to have someone else look over the resume though, because it's a matter of attention to detail. As also mentioned, bad capitalization. When you're calling out an abbreviation with a mix of lowercase and uppercase letters, you want to make sure you're matching what the industry accepted standard is for it. You also want to make sure to keep out no longer relevant technologies, specifically in your skills section. If a technology is dead, don't bother listing it. If you used it 10 years ago, don't bother listing it. When you do something like that, it makes the resume reader or screener think, well, they used to code, but they no longer code because the only experience they have are in all these technologies that stopped being relevant 10 years ago. That can inadvertently talk them out of considering you for a position, even if that's not the case. You also want to limit your experience to that which is relevant. If you've changed careers or changed fields, you may make a footnote of it, but don't have a focus on something that's no longer relevant.